February 14th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh climbed into the cockpit of a Vought F-4U Corsair that he'd flown for less than 30 hours. The bent-winged fighter sat among 11 others from Marine Fighting Squadron 1, 2, 4, engines warming in the tropical morning heat. Walsh had arrived on this blood-soaked island just 2 days earlier, and the squadron had flown its first mission yesterday, an uneventful escort run. Today would be different. Today, VMF 124 would escort Consolidated B-24 Liberators on a bombing raid against the Japanese aerodrome at Kahili. As Walsh advanced the throttle and felt the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine surge to 2,000 horsepower, he carried with him the collective hope of every Marine pilot who had struggled for 6 months against Japanese air superiority. The Wildcat had fought bravely, but it was outclassed. The Zero could outrun it, outturn it, outclimb it. Today, that was supposed to change. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the skies over Kahili that Valentine's Day morning would become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, but not for the reasons anyone expected. 50 Japanese Zeros rose to meet the American formation with the confidence born from 2 years of dominating Pacific skies. The ensuing combat was brutal and chaotic. 4 P-38s fell from the sky. 2 P-40s spiraled downward trailing smoke. 2 Liberators exploded under concentrated fire, and 2 Corsairs, including one that collided with a Zero in a desperate maneuver, were lost. Only 4 Japanese fighters were confirmed destroyed. The debut of America's most powerful carrier fighter had turned into a disaster, but buried in the after-action reports from that failed mission was a single observation that would ultimately terrify Japanese pilots across the entire Pacific theater. During the brief, confused engagement, several Corsair pilots had attempted diving attacks from altitude. What the Japanese pilots experienced in those few seconds was something they had never encountered before. The sound alone was unlike anything heard in aerial combat. As the Corsairs dove, air rushing through the oil cooler intakes at the wing roots created a high-pitched, terrifying whistle that grew louder as the fighters accelerated. The Japanese would give it a name that would echo through their command structure for the rest of the war: whistling death. But the sound was only part of what made those diving Corsairs so shocking. The speed was incomprehensible. In those initial dives over Kahili, Corsair pilots pushed their fighters past 450 miles per hour in steep descents. The closing rate was so extreme that Japanese pilots had perhaps 2 seconds, from first sighting the diving fighter until it flashed past, guns blazing. 2 seconds to identify the threat, 2 seconds to react, 2 seconds to live or die. And when the Corsair pilot pulled out of his dive and zoomed back to altitude, using the tremendous speed he'd gained, no Zero could follow. The Japanese fighter simply lacked the power. A Zero attempting to match that dive and zoom maneuver would find itself falling further behind with every second, engines screaming at maximum power but unable to close the gap. This was something fundamentally new in Pacific air combat. The journey to this moment had begun 5 years earlier, in June 1938, when the United States Navy Bureau of Aeronautics issued one of the most demanding specifications ever written for a carrier fighter. They wanted maximum obtainable speed. They wanted a stalling speed no higher than 70 miles per hour. They wanted 4 guns, or 3 with increased ammunition. They wanted provision for anti-aircraft bombs on the wings, a reflection of pre-war doctrine that imagined fighters dropping small bombs on enemy formations. What the Navy was really asking for was physically impossible with existing technology. You couldn't have maximum speed and low stalling speed in the same airframe. You couldn't pack massive firepower and long range into a carrier-suitable design without compromising something fundamental. Every aircraft designer in America knew the specification was absurd, except Rex Beisel at Chance Vought Aircraft. Beisel's approach was radical in its simplicity. Build the smallest possible airframe around the largest possible engine. The largest engine available in 1938 was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial monster capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. To extract maximum performance from that engine, Beisel specified a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with a diameter of 13 feet, 4 inches. The largest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. That propeller created an immediate problem. To provide ground clearance without using impossibly long landing gear, Beisel's team designed an inverted gull wing. The wing bent downward from the fuselage, allowing the landing gear to be shorter while keeping the massive propeller blades clear of the ground during takeoff rotation. The distinctive configuration made the aircraft instantly recognizable and provided an unexpected aerodynamic benefit. The bend reduced drag where the wing met the fuselage, contributing to overall speed. On May 29, 1940, the prototype XF-4U-1 made its first flight from the Vought factory at Bridgeport, Connecticut. Test pilot Boone Guyton advanced the throttle, and the fighter leaped into the air with startling eagerness. What happened during that maiden flight rewrote the expectations for carrier fighter performance. On October 1, 1940, during a test flight from Stratford to Hartford, the Corsair achieved an average ground speed of 405 miles per hour. A tailwind helped, but the achievement was undeniable. The Corsair became the first single-engine American fighter to break the 400-mile-per-hour barrier in level flight. The Navy was impressed, but further testing revealed serious problems. The most dramatic discovery came during full-power dive tests. Test pilots pushed the Corsair to terminal velocity in vertical dives, reaching speeds approaching 550 miles per hour. The airframe held together, but control surfaces sustained damage. Access panels ripped loose. In one test, the engine failed completely. The Corsair could achieve these extraordinary speeds, but the violence of such dives came at a cost. Spin recovery standards had to be completely relaxed. The Corsair couldn't recover from a two-turn spin without deploying an anti-spin parachute. This was unacceptable for operational use. The Navy's specification called for certain safety margins, and the Corsair couldn't meet them without fundamental redesign. The cockpit placement created another critical problem. To accommodate the long nose and large fuel tank, the cockpit sat far aft in the fuselage. Forward visibility, especially during landing approach, was severely limited. Test pilots described it as flying with a barn door in front of them. They couldn't see the carrier deck until the final seconds of approach. The original birdcage-style canopy made visibility even worse, with heavy framing that blocked sight lines at critical angles. Reports from the war in Europe forced armament changes. The original specification called for two 7.62mm machine guns in the cowling and two 50-caliber guns in the wings. Combat experience showed this was inadequate. The production F-4U-1 would carry 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, all mounted in the wings, with 400 rounds per gun. Total weight of fire, over 3,000 rounds of half-inch ammunition. This was firepower that could shred any aircraft in existence, but with the armament upgrade came more weight. With the cockpit repositioned and strengthened came more weight. With armor plating behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks came more weight. The F-4U-1 that entered production in June 1942 weighed 9,900 pounds, fully loaded for combat. This was significantly heavier than Japanese fighters, significantly heavier than the Wildcat it was meant to replace. Yet despite this weight penalty, the Corsair's performance numbers were extraordinary. Maximum speed, 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet, with the mechanically supercharged engine delivering full power. Rate of climb, 2,890 feet per minute at sea level. Service ceiling, 36,800 feet. Range with internal fuel, 1,015 miles. The Corsair could fly further, faster, and higher than any carrier fighter in the Pacific, but it couldn't land on carriers safely. The poor forward visibility, combined with difficult handling characteristics, resulted in numerous accidents during carrier qualification trials. Pilots bounced hard on landing. They missed the arresting wire. They lost control during the final approach. The casualty rate during training was unacceptable. In a decision that would profoundly impact the Pacific War, the Navy declared the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations and allocated the majority of production to the United States Marine Corps for land-based operations. The Marines needed the Corsair desperately. At Guadalcanal, Marine Wildcat pilots had fought against overwhelming odds from August 1942 through February 1943. They achieved local air superiority through courage, tactics, and blood. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch developed the Thatch Weave, a defensive scissors maneuver that used mutual support to compensate for the Wildcat's performance deficiencies. But defensive tactics could only accomplish so much. The Marines needed an aircraft that could meet the Zero on advantageous terms, and the Corsair promised to be that aircraft. VMF 124 received its first Corsairs in October 1942. The squadron was declared fully operational on December 28, despite the pilots averaging only 25 hours each in the new type. This was barely enough time to master takeoff and landing, much less advanced combat tactics. But the situation in the South Pacific was desperate. Japanese air raids on Henderson Field continued daily. The Cactus Air Force, a mixed collection of Marine, Navy, and Army fighters, was bleeding experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. On February 12, 1943, 12 Corsairs from VMF 124 flew from Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field under the command of Major William Giese. They arrived at noon. At 1 p.m., just 60 minutes after landing, they were scheduled for their first combat mission, escorting a PBY Catalina flying boat to rescue 2 downed Wildcat pilots at Vella La Vella, 230 miles northwest. The mission was uneventful. No Japanese aircraft challenged them. The Catalina recovered the downed pilots safely. The Corsairs returned to Henderson Field. It was an anticlimactic debut, but it gave the squadron pilots their first operational experience with the new fighter under combat conditions. They learned that the Corsair was powerful, fast, and demanding. It required constant attention. The torque from the massive engine tried to roll the aircraft on takeoff. The long nose made formation flying more difficult than in the Wildcat, but the power was intoxicating. When you advanced the throttle to full military power, the Corsair accelerated with authority that no Marine pilot had ever experienced. You could feel the 2,000 horses pulling you forward, pushing you past 300 miles per hour in level flight with ease. The next day, February 14th, VMF 124 flew its second mission, escorting B-24 Liberators to bomb Kahili Aerodrome, the mission that became the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The disaster forced a fundamental reassessment. The Marines realized their pilots needed more training in the new aircraft before facing massed Japanese opposition. They needed to develop tactics specifically designed to exploit the Corsair's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Over the following weeks, surviving pilots from that Valentine's Day engagement worked with squadron commanders to analyze what had gone wrong and what had worked. What worked was altitude and speed. Corsair pilots who maintained altitude advantage and used diving attacks achieved success. What didn't work was trying to turn with Zeros at low speed. The Corsair, despite its power, couldn't match the Zero's turning radius when both aircraft were below 200 knots. The Zero's wing loading was too low, its power-to-weight ratio in slow-speed maneuvering too favorable. Trying to dogfight a Zero on its terms was suicide. The solution was obvious, but required discipline that went against every fighter pilot's instincts. Don't turn with the Zero, ever. Use the Corsair's superior speed and power to dictate engagement terms. Climb to altitude before reaching the combat area. When you spot Japanese fighters below you, dive on them with maximum speed. Fire a concentrated burst during your high-speed pass. Then use the speed gained in your dive to zoom climb back to altitude, extending away from the enemy. If a Zero tries to follow you up, he'll lose energy rapidly while you maintain yours. If he doesn't follow, you've broken contact and can position for another attack. Boom and zoom. It was the same fundamental tactic that German pilots were using in Europe, but applied with an aircraft that had power and performance margins the Zero simply couldn't match. By March 1943, Corsair squadrons throughout the Solomons were practicing these tactics religiously. Pilots who followed the doctrine survived and achieved victories. Pilots who forgot and got drawn into turning fights often died. The Zero was still deadly. It still had more experienced pilots, but the terms of combat were beginning to shift. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh internalized these lessons completely. On April 1st, 1943, he scored his first kill. He was finishing a combat air patrol when he saw Zeros drop on a flight of P-38 Lightnings. Walsh turned back into combat despite being scheduled to return to base. In the general melee that followed, he maintained speed discipline, making slashing attacks and extending away when threatened. He claimed 1 Zero destroyed. On May 13th, Walsh became the first Corsair ace with a 3-kill mission. His technique was evolving into something systematically lethal. He would climb to 25,000 feet before reaching the target area, positioning himself where he could observe the entire battlefield developing below. When he spotted Japanese fighters, he would calculate their altitude and energy state. If they were lower and slower, he would roll into a steep dive, building speed rapidly. At 400 miles per hour plus indicated airspeed, the Corsair became a meteor. The distinctive whistle from the wing root intakes grew to a shriek that carried for miles. Japanese pilots could hear death approaching before they could see the diving fighter. When Walsh pressed the trigger at optimal range, typically 1,000 feet, all 650 caliber Browning guns converged their fire on a single point. The combined weight of 3,600 rounds of ammunition stored in the wings meant he could fire sustained bursts without worrying about conservation. 360 grains of lead and copper jacket, repeated 18 times per second per gun. 108 projectiles per second total, each traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The destructive effect on unarmored Japanese aircraft was catastrophic. The Zero's .032-inch aluminum skin, designed for extreme lightness and range, offered essentially no resistance. A single second of concentrated fire from Walsh's guns would put over 100 half-inch bullets into the target. Fuel tanks erupted instantly. Control surfaces shredded. Airframes came apart in mid-air. Then Walsh would pull out of his dive, using the enormous speed he'd accumulated to climb back to altitude, while extending beyond the range of any pursuing aircraft. The Zero pilots would watch him disappear upward, unable to follow, unable to catch him, unable to prevent him from repositioning for another attack. By June 1943, Japanese commanders in the South Pacific were receiving disturbing after-action reports. The new American fighter was changing the character of aerial combat in ways that nullified traditional Japanese advantages. Experienced Zero pilots described the Corsair with a mixture of respect and fear. It was faster than the Zero at all altitudes. It could dive faster than any aircraft they'd encountered. It could climb away from pursuit. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero and continue fighting. The sound it made during high-speed dives was psychologically devastating to troops on the ground and pilots in the air. Some reports mentioned that the whistle preceded attacks by seconds, giving just enough warning to recognize impending danger, but not enough time to react effectively. Japanese Naval Aviation Command issued its first tactical bulletins about the Corsair in summer 1943. The directives acknowledged that the new American fighter possessed performance characteristics exceeding the Type 0 in most regimes. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged vertical maneuvering when engaged with Corsairs. They were advised to attempt drawing American fighters into low-altitude horizontal combat, where Zero advantages might still apply. This represented a significant psychological shift. For 2 years, Japanese fighter doctrine had emphasized offensive aggression and accepting combat whenever encountered. Now, for the first time, official directives were telling pilots to avoid certain types of engagement with certain enemy aircraft. That wasn't tactical adaptation. That was acknowledgement of fundamental inferiority. The directives made tactical sense on paper, but implementing them in combat was vastly more difficult. The whole concept assumed Japanese pilots could refuse combat when conditions were unfavorable. But how do you refuse combat when you're assigned to defend a specific airfield or shipping route? How do you refuse combat when your mission is to intercept American bombers? Attacking your base? The Corsair pilots understood this asymmetry and exploited it ruthlessly. They would maintain altitude advantage and wait for the Japanese fighters to reveal themselves by engaging the bombers. Then they would dive on the engaged fighters, destroying them while they were focused on other targets. The deeper problem was that even when Japanese pilots successfully avoided high-altitude encounters, they couldn't prevent Corsair pilots from diving through their formations at will. A Corsair at 25,000 feet, watching a formation of Zeros at 15,000 feet, could simply push over into a dive whenever the geometry looked favorable. Accelerating past 450 miles per hour, the Corsair would be on top of the Japanese formation within seconds. The pilot would fire a burst at close range, destroying or damaging one aircraft, then continue his dive right through the formation and extend away at low altitude before any Zero could react. The Japanese fighters could scatter. They could turn hard, trying to bring guns to bear, but they couldn't catch the diving Corsair or prevent it from escaping. If the Zero pilots dove after the American, trying to pursue and extract revenge, they found themselves in an even worse tactical situation. The Corsair pilot would simply extend in the dive, pulling further ahead thanks to superior speed and better high-speed handling. Then, once the Zero was committed to the dive and had expended its altitude for speed, the Corsair pilot would pull out gradually and transition into a zoom climb. The Zero pilot, now low and fast but not as fast as the Corsair, had to make an impossible choice. Chase the climbing Corsair and lose energy rapidly until you stall out and become a sitting target, or maintain your speed and altitude, conceding the initiative while the American climbs back up to attack again. There were no good options. The Corsair held the cards. Japanese pilots began reporting that Corsairs controlled the vertical dimension of combat. Altitude was survival. The Americans understood this and systematically maintained altitude advantage through disciplined tactical discipline. Individual aggressive spirit, which had served Japanese pilots so well in China and in the early Pacific campaigns, became a liability against opponents who fought with cold calculation and refused to accept unfavorable engagements. The systematic exploitation of vertical advantage reached its peak in September 1943 when Marine Fighting Squadron 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, arrived in the South Pacific under the command of Major Gregory Pappy Boyington. Boyington was not a typical Marine officer. He was 31 years old, considered ancient by fighter pilot standards. He'd flown with the American Volunteer Group in China before Pearl Harbor, claiming 6 victories with the Flying Tigers, though his score was disputed. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, displayed little patience for military protocol. But he understood energy fighting with an intuitive brilliance that made him extraordinarily dangerous in combat. Boyington selected his pilots carefully, choosing men who had been rejected by other squadrons for various infractions or personality conflicts. Misfits, troublemakers, and individualists. He molded them into a unit that exemplified the Corsair's tactical doctrine taken to its logical extreme. The Black Sheep would climb to extreme altitude before reaching the combat area, often 30,000 feet or higher where the thin air made breathing difficult and the cold penetrated flight suits. From that altitude, they could see Japanese formations developing below them like pieces on a chessboard. Boyington would study the tactical situation, analyzing altitude, heading, and formation structure. Then he would roll his flight into dives calculated for maximum destructive effect. The Black Sheep's first major engagement came on September 16th, 1943, over Balali Island in the Solomons. Japanese radar detected the incoming American strike package and scrambled approximately 40 Zeros to intercept. Boyington led his Corsairs to 28,000 feet, positioning them 3,000 feet above the climbing Japanese formation. He waited until the Zeros committed to intercepting the American bombers below. Then he pushed over into a dive that would become his signature tactic. 20 Corsairs diving simultaneously from 28,000 feet, each accelerating past 420 miles per hour, created a sound like the sky tearing open. The whistling from 20 sets of wing root intakes combined into a shriek that Japanese pilots later described as demonic. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who heard that sound approaching from above knew they had perhaps 3 seconds before the Americans were among them with guns firing. Boyington's first burst hit a zero at 800 feet range, and the Japanese fighter exploded instantly. Its unprotected fuel tanks ignited, creating a fireball that tumbled toward the ocean, trailing black smoke. Boyington continued his dive through the Japanese formation without attempting to turn or maneuver. He simply fired at targets of opportunity as they appeared in his gun sight, then extended away at low altitude before any Zero could respond. His wingmen followed the same tactic with devastating precision. The entire attack lasted perhaps 15 seconds from first contact to disengagement. In those 15 seconds, the Black Sheep destroyed 6 Zeros without loss. The surviving Japanese pilots scattered in confusion, abandoning their intercept of the bombers. By the time they reformed and attempted to pursue the Corsairs, Boyington's flight was already climbing back to altitude 3 miles away. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was Boom and Zoom perfected into systematic slaughter. Over the next 6 weeks, the Black Sheep flew mission after mission, using identical tactics: climb high, position favorably, dive through enemy formations, extend away, climb back to altitude. The Japanese couldn't counter it effectively because countering it required capabilities their aircraft didn't possess. A Zero couldn't climb to 30,000 feet, carrying full fuel and ammunition, while maintaining enough energy to maneuver effectively. Even if it reached that altitude, the Corsair could simply extend away using superior speed. Japanese pilots found themselves consistently fighting from positions of disadvantage, regardless of their skill or experience. On October 17, 1943, the Black Sheep encountered a large formation of Japanese fighters and bombers over Kahili. Boyington counted approximately 60 enemy aircraft. His flight numbered 24 Corsairs. The numerical odds were roughly even, but the tactical advantage was overwhelming. Boyington positioned his fighters at 25,000 feet, directly above the Japanese formation at 18,000 feet. He divided his squadron into sections of 4 aircraft each, assigning each section a specific target area within the enemy formation. Then he led the attack himself. Diving at maximum power, the Corsairs hit the Japanese formation like a hammer striking an eggshell. Boyington destroyed 2 bombers in his initial pass, his 650 caliber guns shredding the unarmored airframes. He pulled out of his dive and immediately transitioned into a zoom climb, gaining 2,000 feet in seconds while the Japanese fighters tried to reorient. His wingman, Captain George Ashmun, followed 20 seconds behind and claimed 1 Zero that attempted to pursue Boyington upward. The Zero pilot made the fatal error of trying to follow the climbing Corsair. His aircraft slowed dramatically as it expended energy in the climb, eventually hanging almost motionless in the air at the top of its trajectory. Ashmun simply positioned himself below the Zero and fired a 3-second burst straight up into its unprotected belly. The Zero came apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling separately toward the ocean. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 20 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. Not a single Corsair was lost, though several sustained minor battle damage. The kill ratio that day was effectively infinite. More importantly, the psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating. After-action reports from Japanese units engaged at Kahili described the American tactics in terms that bordered on hopeless frustration. One surviving pilot's account, translated by American intelligence, stated that the new American fighters controlled when and how combat occurred. Japanese pilots could not force engagement on favorable terms. They could not escape when conditions became unfavorable. They could not climb to match American altitude without exhausting themselves. The report concluded with a remarkably candid assessment. Traditional Japanese fighter tactics, emphasizing maneuverability and turning combat, were becoming obsolete against opponents who refused to turn and who possessed overwhelming power advantages. Japanese Naval Aviation Command distributed these reports throughout the fleet with increasing urgency. Additional tactical directives were issued in October and November 1943. The language became more explicit and more desperate. Pilots were instructed to avoid engaging Corsairs at altitudes above 20,000 feet whenever possible. If engagement at high altitude was unavoidable, pilots were to dive away immediately to lower altitudes, where zero maneuverability might provide some advantage. Under no circumstances were pilots to attempt following diving Corsairs or to engage in vertical pursuit. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. A Corsair in a 45-degree dive would accelerate to 450 miles per hour within seconds. The Zero's maximum dive speed was approximately 360 miles per hour before structural concerns became serious. The math was simple. The Corsair dove 100 miles per hour faster. In practical terms, this meant the American pilot could open the distance from 1,000 feet to over 2,000 feet in just 30 seconds of diving. 2,000 feet separation meant the Zero pilot couldn't even see the Corsair clearly, much less bring guns to bear. But the most terrifying aspect of Corsair dive performance wasn't the speed itself, it was the consistency. A Corsair could make repeated high-speed dives without structural concern. The airframe was built heavily specifically to handle these stresses. American pilots learned they could dive the Corsair all day long without worrying about losing wings or control surfaces. Japanese pilots in Zeros knew their aircraft had limits. Push too hard in a dive, exceed terminal velocity by too much, pull out too aggressively, and something would break. Wings would fold. Control surfaces would tear off. The pilot would die. This psychological factor was as important as the performance difference. American pilots could dive with confidence, knowing their aircraft would hold together. Japanese pilots dove with fear, knowing they were approaching their aircraft's structural limits. Marine pilot First Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215 demonstrated the Corsair's diving capability with methodical precision throughout late 1943 and early 1944. Hansen had an unusual background for a fighter pilot. He was the son of Methodist missionaries and had been born in India. He'd witnessed Nazi occupation of Austria in 1938 while on a bicycle tour. These experiences gave him a perspective on the war that differed from typical American pilots. He fought with calculated coldness, showing no mercy and expecting none. Hansen's technique was to climb to extreme altitude, often 32,000 feet, and patrol above active combat areas. When he spotted Japanese fighters engaging American aircraft below, he would watch patiently until a target isolated itself or became fixated on another aircraft. Then he would roll into a near-vertical dive, building speed to maximum. At 460 miles per hour indicated airspeed, Hansen would open fire from 1,000 feet, walk his tracers onto the target, and continue firing until he was at point-blank range. The closing speed was so extreme that he often had less than 2 seconds from trigger press to pull out. Multiple Japanese pilots never saw Hansen coming. The first indication they had of his attack was the sound of their aircraft disintegrating around them. Between August 1943 and January 1944, Hansen destroyed 20 Japanese aircraft. In one 17-day period, he shot down 20 planes. On January 14, 1944, he destroyed 5 aircraft in a single mission. His tactics were simple, brutal, and enabled entirely by the Corsair's dive performance. Hansen was killed on February 3, 1944, when his Corsair crashed into the sea during an escort mission over Rabaul. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His combat record demonstrated what was possible when dive speed advantage was exploited systematically by a skilled pilot with no hesitation. By early 1944, Japanese fighter doctrine in the Central and South Pacific had evolved into something approaching defensive desperation. Official directives now explicitly stated that Corsairs should not be engaged at altitudes above 20,000 feet unless absolutely necessary for mission accomplishment. Pilots were instructed to maintain formations at 15,000 feet, or and below, when operating in areas where Corsairs were known to be active. This altitude restriction was an admission that the Japanese had ceded control of the upper airspace. They were conceding the high ground voluntarily because contesting it was suicidal. But even this defensive adaptation provided limited protection. Corsair pilots simply adjusted their tactics. If the Japanese stayed at 15,000 feet, American fighters would patrol at 25,000 feet and make longer dives. The geometry still favored the Corsair. A 10,000-foot altitude advantage translated to even higher terminal velocity in the dive, even higher closing speeds, even less reaction time for Japanese pilots. Some Japanese pilots attempted creative counters. They would watch for Corsairs at high altitude and preemptively dive to very low altitude, perhaps 5,000 feet or below, hoping the Americans wouldn't follow them down. This tactic occasionally worked because American pilots were instructed to maintain altitude whenever possible. Diving to low altitude to pursue a single zero meant sacrificing positional advantage for limited gain. But enterprising Corsair pilots developed a counter to this counter. They would detail 1 or 2 aircraft from each flight to make the low dive and pursue the fleeing zeros, while the rest of the formation maintained altitude. The low detail would make a single high-speed pass, then use their speed to climb back to rejoin the formation. The Japanese pilot who dove away to escape found himself pursued anyway, and his escape maneuver had isolated him from mutual support. The relentless tactical pressure forced Japanese naval aviation into an impossible position. Every adaptation they attempted was countered by American pilots who had better aircraft, better training, and increasing experience. By mid-1944, the average American Corsair pilot arrived in the combat zone with over 300 flight hours and extensive gunnery training. The average Japanese pilot arriving in the same period had 100 hours or less, sometimes as few as 40 hours total flight time. These barely trained pilots were expected to face veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft using proven tactics. The outcome was predetermined. Inexperienced Japanese pilots attempting to implement complex defensive tactics against diving Corsairs simply died. They didn't have the skill to recognize developing situations early enough. They didn't have the experience to execute proper defensive maneuvers. They didn't have the flight hours to maintain formation discipline under attack. The tactical directives warning against high-altitude engagement became meaningless when novice pilots couldn't properly judge altitude anyway. A pilot with 40 hours of training couldn't accurately estimate that a diving Corsair was at 22,000 feet versus 18,000 feet. By the time they recognized the threat, it was too late. The whistle was already growing louder. The Corsair was already in its dive. Death was seconds away. American intelligence officers noticed the changing quality of Japanese resistance in after-action reports throughout 1944. Early in the year, combat engagements still featured skilled Japanese pilots who executed proper defensive tactics and occasionally achieved victories. By June, intelligence reports noted that Japanese resistance was becoming increasingly ineffective. Pilots made fundamental errors. They flew predictable patterns. They broke formation under pressure. They attempted to turn fight Corsairs despite explicit orders not to. These weren't failures of doctrine. These were failures of training. Japan's pilot training pipeline had collapsed under the pressure of unsustainable combat losses. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944, demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese naval aviation effectiveness against coordinated American fighters. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched 4 massive strikes against American carrier task forces off Saipan. The strikes numbered over 400 aircraft, including Zeros, Vals, Jills, and various other types. American radar detected the incoming raids at extreme range, giving F-6F Hellcat fighters time to position optimally. But multiple Corsair squadrons were also operating in the area from land bases, and they intercepted Japanese formations as they approached the American fleet. The Corsairs held altitude advantage and used familiar diving tactics. The results were one-sided slaughter. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, now a captain and an ace many times over, led a flight of Corsairs that intercepted a Japanese formation approaching from the northwest. Walsh climbed to 28,000 feet and waited for the perfect geometry. When the Japanese bombers reached 18,000 feet with their Zero escorts struggling to keep up, Walsh rolled into his attack. 6 Corsairs diving simultaneously, the whistling death shriek that Japanese pilots had learned to fear. Walsh's first burst hit a bomber that disintegrated under the concentrated fire. His second burst destroyed another. He pulled out of his dive, transitioned to a zoom climb, and was back at altitude within 90 seconds. His flight claimed 9 aircraft destroyed in that single engagement without loss. Similar scenes repeated throughout the day. Japanese formations were shredded by diving attacks they couldn't counter. By day's end, Japanese carrier aviation had lost approximately 250 aircraft. American losses were minimal. The battle demonstrated that Japanese pilots, regardless of courage or determination, simply couldn't survive against the combination of superior American aircraft and systematic exploitation of performance advantages. The Corsair's dive speed specifically contributed to the disaster. Japanese pilots who saw Corsairs at high altitude would attempt to dive away to lower altitude where they hoped to survive, but the Corsairs could dive faster. They would catch the fleeing Japanese aircraft in the dive, destroy them, then pull out and climb away before escorts could respond. There was no escape, no safe altitude, no defensive maneuver that worked consistently. By late 1944, captured Japanese documents and interrogated prisoners confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. Japanese fighter doctrine now explicitly stated that Corsairs should be avoided whenever possible. If engagement was unavoidable, pilots were instructed to operate at low altitude and attempt to draw Americans into horizontal turning combat. Under no circumstances should pilots allow Corsairs to maintain altitude advantage or engage in vertical combat above 20,000 feet. This wasn't tactical guidance. This was an instruction manual for survival. The problem was that survival wasn't compatible with mission accomplishment. If your mission was to intercept American bombers, you couldn't refuse combat. If your mission was to defend an airfield, you couldn't dive to low altitude and hide. You had to climb to meet the threat, and when you climbed, the Corsairs were waiting above you. They had been waiting for 2 years. They knew you were coming. They had practiced the dive attack 1,000 times. They would kill you with methodical precision, then climb back to altitude and wait for the next target. The mathematics of attrition were unsustainable for Japan. Marine Major Gregory Boyington never saw the ultimate vindication of Corsair tactics. On January 3, 1944, during a fighter sweep over Rabaul, his Corsair was hit by anti-aircraft fire and shot down. He spent the remainder of the war in a Japanese prisoner camp. He emerged in August 1945 with 28 confirmed victories, 22 of them flying Corsairs. His Black Sheep Squadron had pioneered the systematic high-altitude tactics that other squadrons would refine and employ for the rest of the war. The squadron achieved 97 confirmed kills and damaged another 103 aircraft in just 87 days of combat. Their success ratio demonstrated what was possible when aircraft performance advantages were exploited without mercy or hesitation. The Corsair's dominance wasn't purely about dive speed. The aircraft brought multiple advantages to combat. 6 50-caliber guns with 400 rounds each provided firepower that exceeded most contemporary fighters. Armor protection behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks provided survivability that allowed pilots to survive hits that would kill Zero pilots. Robust construction meant Corsairs returned to base with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. But the dive speed was the capability that broke Japanese fighter resistance psychologically. It made altitude supremacy absolute. It made escape impossible. It made every engagement occur on American terms. Japanese pilots couldn't force Corsairs to fight their fight. They couldn't choose favorable conditions. They couldn't disengage when things went badly. The Americans held all the cards, and they played them ruthlessly. By 1945, Corsairs were operating from fleet carriers, escort carriers, and island bases throughout the Pacific. They flew fighter sweeps, bomber escort, close air support, and ground attack missions. Their versatility was remarkable, but their primary mission remained air superiority, and in that mission, they were utterly dominant. The final statistics told a story of complete tactical victory. Corsairs shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft during World War II at a loss of 189 Corsairs in air-to-air combat. That represented an 11-to-1 kill ratio, the highest of any major fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. Against Zeros specifically, the ratio exceeded 12-to-1. These weren't just numbers. They represented thousands of individual combats where American pilots used altitude, speed, and diving attacks to destroy Japanese aircraft that had once dominated Pacific skies. The Japanese tried desperately to develop counters. They introduced the Kawanishi N1K2J Shiden, a powerful fighter with performance approaching the Corsair. They developed the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden specifically for high-altitude interception. But these aircraft entered service too late and in too few numbers. Only 1,500 Shiden fighters were built. Production problems, engine reliability issues, and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities prevented mass deployment. Even when these superior fighters reached operational squadrons, pilot quality had degraded so severely that the aircraft's capabilities couldn't be fully exploited. A talented pilot in a Zero was more effective than a novice in a theoretically superior Shiden. The training, pipeline collapse was killing Japanese naval aviation more surely than combat. Pre-war Japanese pilots trained for 700 hours before joining operational squadrons. By mid-1944, new pilots arrived with 100 hours. By early 1945, some had as few as 40 hours total flight time. These pilots couldn't execute the complex defensive maneuvers required to survive against Corsairs. They couldn't judge altitude properly. They couldn't maintain formation discipline. They couldn't recognize developing threats early enough to react. American pilots with 300 hours of training and systematic tactical instruction simply killed them. The vertical advantage that Corsairs provided turned combat into execution. American pilots would climb to altitude, wait for Japanese fighters to reveal themselves, then dive through the formations, destroying aircraft at will. The Japanese couldn't prevent these attacks. They couldn't punish American pilots who made mistakes because there were no mistakes to punish. The tactics were sound. The aircraft was superior. The training was comprehensive. By April 1945, during the battle for Okinawa, Japanese fighter resistance had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Most remaining Japanese aircraft were committed to kamikaze suicide attacks rather than air-to-air combat. The doctrine recognized that Japanese pilots couldn't compete with American fighters, so they might as well use aircraft as guided missiles. Corsairs transitioned to primarily ground attack and anti-kamikaze patrol roles. They still flew combat air patrol missions, but enemy fighters were increasingly rare. When they did encounter Japanese aircraft, the results were predetermined. A skilled Corsair pilot facing a novice Japanese pilot in any aircraft type would win. The performance advantage was just too overwhelming. First Lieutenant Robert Klingman's experience on May 10, 1945, illustrated both Corsair capabilities and the desperation of late-war Japanese operations. Klingman and Captain Kenneth Reuser were flying combat air patrol north of Okinawa when they spotted a Japanese Kawasaki Ki 45 twin-engine fighter at 25,000 feet, taking reconnaissance photographs. The two Marines climbed to intercept, but the Japanese pilot climbed to 38,000 feet above the Corsair's optimal operating altitude. Klingman and Reuser dumped their external fuel tanks and half their ammunition to reduce weight, allowing them to reach extreme altitude. At 38,000 feet, the air was so thin that engines delivered barely 60% of rated power. The cold was extreme. Both pilots were approaching the limits of human endurance. Reuser caught the Ki 45 first and fired his remaining ammunition into the aircraft, hitting the right wing and engine. But his guns ran empty before the Japanese fighter was completely destroyed. Klingman moved into a position for a finishing shot, only to discover his guns had frozen solid from the extreme cold. With no other option, he decided to use his propeller as a weapon. Klingman closed to within feet of the Ki 45's tail and allowed his spinning propeller to contact the enemy aircraft's rudder and stabilizer. The massive Hamilton Standard propeller, spinning at thousands of RPM, tore through the Ki 45's tail like a saw. 3 passes completely severed the rudder and right stabilizer. The Japanese fighter tumbled out of control and crashed into the Pacific. Klingman's Corsair sustained severe damage from the impacts. The engine was failing. The propeller was bent and unbalanced. He descended toward Kadena Airfield with a dying engine and made a dead-stick landing, touching down without power. Post-flight inspection found pieces of the Japanese aircraft embedded in the Corsair's engine cowling. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service. Klingman received the Navy Cross. The incident demonstrated the Corsair's structural toughness and its pilot's determination, but it also showed the desperation of Japanese operations. A reconnaissance aircraft flying at extreme altitude in hostile airspace with no fighter escort was a suicide mission by any rational standard. The war ended in August 1945, with Corsairs flying from carriers off the Japanese coast. They participated in the final strikes against the home islands, encountering minimal resistance. Japanese fighters that did rise to intercept were destroyed quickly and efficiently. The tactical lessons learned over 3 years of combat were so thoroughly internalized that engagements became almost routine. Climb to altitude, position favorably, dive through enemy formation, extend away, climb back to altitude. Execute. The routine produced consistent results because the physics hadn't changed. The Corsair still dove faster than any Japanese aircraft. American pilots still maintained altitude discipline. Japanese pilots still couldn't counter tactics that exploited overwhelming performance advantages. The Corsair would continue flying in combat for another decade. During the Korean War, Corsairs provided close air support with devastating effectiveness. Navy Lieutenant Guy Bordelon became the only Navy ace of that war, shooting down 5 North Korean aircraft while flying an F-4 U-5 Newton's night fighter. One of his victories was against a Yakovlev Yak-18, making him possibly the last propeller-driven ace in history. The aircraft served with foreign air forces into the 1960s. The French used Corsairs in Indochina and Algeria, Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, and Honduras all operated the type. The final combat use came during the Football War in July 1969, when Honduran and Salvadoran Corsairs fought each other in what were quite possibly the last propeller-driven dogfights in history. Honduran Captain Fernando Soto shot down 2 Salvadoran Corsairs, becoming the only pilot ever to score multiple Corsair versus Corsair victories. But the Corsair's defining moment was the Pacific War, 1943 through 1945. That was when the bent-wing bird broke Japanese aerial dominance through systematic exploitation of dive speed advantage. The whistle that terrified Japanese ground troops and pilots, the 450-mile-per-hour dives that came from nowhere and disappeared before any response was possible. The altitude advantage that American pilots guarded fanatically, the boom and zoom tactics that turned combat into execution. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's captured Zero at Akutan had revealed Japan's weaknesses. The F-6F Hellcat had exploited vertical climbing advantage, but the Corsair perfected the high-speed diving attack into something approaching art. The mathematics were simple. Altitude equals potential energy. Diving converts potential energy to kinetic energy. More altitude plus more dive speed equals more kinetic energy. More kinetic energy equals higher speed equals less reaction time for the enemy equals higher probability of kill. Japanese pilots learned this equation the hard way. They learned it in the Solomons when VMF 124 pioneered high-speed tactics. They learned it over Rabaul when the Black Sheep made altitude supremacy absolute. They learned it in the Marianas when their fleet carriers lost 300 aircraft in 2 days. They learned it over Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands. By war's end, Japanese tactical doctrine explicitly warned pilots to avoid high-altitude engagement with Corsairs. That warning acknowledged a fundamental shift in Pacific air combat. The Americans controlled the vertical dimension. They controlled engagement timing. They controlled whether combat even occurred. Japanese fighters that once ruled the Pacific skies were reduced to avoiding combat whenever possible and hoping to survive when combat was unavoidable. the Corsair achieved its dominance not through any single revolutionary technology, but through the systematic combination of power, structure, and tactics. The massive R2800 engine provided the power to climb and accelerate. The robust airframe provided the structural strength to survive high-speed dives repeatedly. The 650 caliber guns provided the firepower to destroy with single bursts, and American pilots provided the tactical discipline to exploit these advantages without mercy. But perhaps the most important factor was something simpler. American pilots learned from their mistakes. After the St. Valentine's Day massacre, they analyzed what went wrong and developed better tactics. After every engagement, they refined their techniques. Intelligence summaries distributed lessons learned throughout the fleet. Training evolved continuously. Pilots arriving in the combat zone already understood how to fight their aircraft effectively. This systematic approach to tactical evolution gave the Americans an advantage that transcended simple aircraft performance. They learned faster than their opponents. They adapted more effectively. They shared knowledge more efficiently. By 1945, an American Corsair pilot with minimal combat experience could survive and achieve victories because he'd learned from every engagement flown by every Corsair pilot since February 1943. The Japanese never developed equivalent systematic learning. Tactical knowledge remained trapped in individual units. Veteran pilots who learned effective survival techniques died before passing that knowledge to replacements. Training degraded as the war progressed rather than improving. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with less preparation than their predecessors, not more. The Americans built a learning institution. The Japanese suffered institutional collapse. When these two forces met in combat, aircraft performance mattered, but organizational effectiveness mattered more. The Corsair was a superb fighter aircraft. In the hands of well-trained pilots following sound doctrine, it was devastatingly effective. But it was the system behind the aircraft that made it truly war-winning. That system took the young man who'd never seen combat and transformed him into a disciplined fighter pilot who understood energy management, altitude advantage, and boom and zoom tactics. Who knew that diving at 450 miles per hour made you nearly invulnerable. Who understood that altitude was life and speed was survival. Who had internalized the lessons learned through thousands of combat engagements. The whistle that Japanese pilots learned to fear wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of systematic American tactical superiority, converting potential energy to kinetic energy to certain death. It was the sound of an aircraft designed for power-meeting pilots trained for effectiveness. It was the sound of an enemy who learned faster, adapted better, and fought smarter. The Mitsubishi Zero had dominated Pacific skies through lightness and maneuverability. The Corsair dominated through power and vertical energy. One philosophy emphasized what you could avoid. The other emphasized what you could deliver. By 1945, the answer was clear. Power delivered from altitude at maximum speed won. Maneuverability without armor, without power, without protection, lost. The Japanese learned this lesson through blood across 3 years of combat. Their tactical directives evolved from offensive confidence to defensive desperation, to explicit instructions to avoid engagement whenever possible. That evolution told the story of the Pacific Air War more clearly than any statistic. The Americans had learned to fly their Corsairs in ways that made combat occur exclusively on American terms. And when combat occurred on American terms, Japanese pilots died. It was that simple, that brutal, that decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.